long does it take you to paint a picture?
Well, sometimes a day, sometimes a year. You can't tell. It has to grow.
I never knew paint could grow.
Feeling grows. You know, that's the important thing, feeling. Well, now you take me. Well, nobody ever taught me how to draw, so I just put a line around what I feel when I look at things.
Yeah, I see.
It's like falling in love, I guess. You know, first you see someone and it keeps growing until you can't think of anyone else.
That's interesting.
Well, the way I look at things, that's all art is. Every painting, if it's any good, is a love affair.
I never heard anyone talk like that before.
Scarlet Street from 1940 was a fantastic film noir directed by legendary director Fritz Lang and starring Edward G. Robinson, Joan Bennett, and Dan Duryea. And hooray, it's in the public domain, so no dealing with copyright claims this time. Thanks to YouTuber CreateVision for the recommendation of this film. And thanks to everybody who recommends films. I do try to get to all of them, no telling when, but I really appreciate any suggestions that you bring. So I'll give a summary of Scarlet Street, no spoilers at the end, and then offer some closing thoughts.
Chris? Read what's engraved inside, Chris.
To my friend Christopher Cross, in token of 25 years of faithful service, from J.J. Hogarth, 1909-1934.
Well, the film opens up. It's at a big, smoky dinner party, and we have Edward G. Robinson playing the character Christopher Cross. No, not the guy who sang, "Sailing Takes Me Away." Well, he's there being celebrated for 25 years on the job. And he's presented with a watch by his boss, JJ. Actor Russell Hicks. I actually caught him recently in the film Tarzan's New York Adventure. Well, after Chris makes a speech, JJ offers him a cigar. Swell guy. So we see that this character Chris is a loyal company man. He's fairly quiet and unassuming. Now, JJ leaves the party, and shortly after, the guys gather around a window and notice with great amusement that he's apparently got a sweet young lady waiting to see him. Chris talks with Charlie, played by actor Samuel Hines, as they wait for their bus to arrive. You know, and he's sort of speculating, I wonder what it's like to be loved by a young woman like that. Be careful with that foreshadowing there, Chris. Well, Charlie gets on his bus, and Chris continues walking home in the dark. And on the way, he sees a young woman being smacked around by some guy. So he charges in and hits a guy with his umbrella, knocks him to the curb, and knocks him out. And he rescues the lady, but she urges him not to bother with the police, but instead that they should just let it go. So he offers to buy her a cup of coffee, and they head to a local bar. Her name is Kitty, and she's played by lovely actress Joan Bennett. So Chris seems totally interested in this young lady. You know, he's a middle-aged guy, and like his boss from a few scenes earlier, maybe he's thinking it would be nice to get the attention of a young lady. Kitty, however, doesn't seem to be interested in him the same way. She sees that he's well-dressed, and when he talks about being an artist, she thinks that maybe he's secretly a wealthy artist selling his paintings. And we can tell she's not really interested in him as a person, but rather trying to assess if he's a sucker that can be manipulated. Well, they have a few drinks and then call it a night, and she heads home. She doesn't give away her phone number or anything like that, and as far as we can tell, they may never see each other again. So Chris goes back home, and he does some of his hobby painting. Now, he has to do it in secret in the bathroom of all places. So painting is just something he does for fun outside of his day job. You know, sort of like running a YouTube channel reviewing old movies from the 1940s. It doesn't really reward him very much monetarily, but he has fun with it, and he does it for his own amusement. Well, his buddy Charlie from work stops by to see his painting. Now, around here, we get a little background on Chris and his wife, a really nasty bully named Adele, who's just played amazingly here by Rosalind Ivan. Poor Chris has to put on this apron to clean up the kitchen while Adele just berates him, complaining about how much better her deceased husband was. And she's even got his picture hanging on the wall. So their marriage, let's just say, is not in a very good state.
Well, why can't that old skinflint Hogarth give you a raise? You don't even make enough money to buy me a radio. I have to run downstairs every night to listen to the radio. The way I have to scrimp and save and you wasting money on paints. I'd like to know what you'd do without me. Poor dear Homer. If only he had a grave where I could put some flowers. Why, you couldn't even ask me to marry you. I had to put the words into your mouth. I'd have been better off a widow. The only reason I put up with you is because I'm married to you. I'm stuck.
Yes, and I'm stuck, too.
So later, over at Kitty's place, we discover that she is engaged to the character Johnny. And this was the same guy that was slapping her around earlier in the film. He's played here by actor Dan Duryea. Great actor. I saw him recently in the film Too Late for Tears. He finds out about this Chris character and urges Kitty to try to fake a relationship with him in order to swindle money out of him. He is just a jerk of a character in this film. He mistreats her, talks bad to her, slaps her around sometimes. That's his character through this film, and this is Dan Duryea plays nasty characters very well. I mean, he's great to watch, but he's also awful at the same time. Now, around this time, her roommate Millie arrives home. She's played by actress Margaret Lindsay. She doesn't seem all that fond of Johnny either. She also seems annoyed at Kitty's laziness. Because, I mean, she just lounges around, dumps her cigarettes into a filthy sink and stuff like that. So she doesn't have a lot of drive to her life. We don't really know what her story is from the film, just that she's kind of doing nothing, but might be open to the idea of manipulating this character, Chris. And sure enough, a little later on, Chris is having lunch with Kitty. Chris, we can see, is just smitten with her, thinking she might be an actress or something, and that this Johnny character is just a boyfriend of her roommate. Poor sap. She sees that he's really fallen for her, and she starts up with her scheme, mentioning that she's broke, and asks if he would help pay for her new place. It could also be his artist studio, she says. And he confesses that he is married and he's in a loveless marriage, and of course, she acts all surprised. But that doesn't slow her interest in having him help her get a fancy apartment in Greenwich Village.
The truth is, I'm in a jam.
You, Kitty?
Oh, you probably guessed it. I'm broke. Even this dress belongs to Millie. I can't pay my rent.
Well, how much is it?
Oh, forget it. I shouldn't have told you. It'll spoil your day.
Oh, but Kitty...
I'll get out of it somehow. I couldn't take anything from you, Chris.
No. Yes, I mean...
No, I couldn't. I've never taken money from a man, and I'm not going to now. And I'm not going to spoil our friendship.
Oh, but Kitty,
I couldn't pay you back.
Oh.
Chris, maybe I could pay you back. If you put up the money for a studio apartment, then I'd have a place to live and you could paint there. Don't you see? You could paint my portrait.
So Chris gives in, and he's able to afford this new expensive apartment for her by taking some money from the cashier's box at work, and also from using some bonds from Adele's late husband's life insurance. Now, Adele really hates Chris, and even threatens to gather up all of his paintings to get rid of them. You know, I don't think there was one moment of empathy from her character in the entirety of this film toward him. But Chris is able to move all of his paintings to this new apartment to keep them safe there. So Kitty settles into the apartment, and she's still seeing this shady character Johnny on the side when Chris isn't there. And Johnny sees some of these paintings and gets the idea to try to sell them in a marketplace in Greenwich Village. And there's a street painter there, and he agrees to leave the art with him with the hopes that maybe some of the paintings will sell for a little bit of money. But wouldn't you know it, along comes a famous art critic, David Janeway, played by actor Jess Balker, and he buys these paintings thinking they're masterpieces and he wants more. So this art critic, he's so moved by the art that he and an art dealer actually follow Johnny back to this apartment where they spot some of the artwork inside. And he is insistent on meeting the artist. And it's here, on the spot, that Johnny just makes up this lie that Kitty painted them. So she goes along with this and even uses some of the same things that Chris had told her earlier in the film.
How long does it take you to paint a picture?
Sometimes a day, sometimes a year. You can't tell. It has to grow.
Of course.
It's a matter of feeling. You know how how feeling grows? It's like falling in love, I guess.
That's a very good description.
The way I look at it, every painting, if it's any good, is a love affair.
So this art dealer, Janeway, offers to put her work into galleries and exhibitions. So Kitty basically goes into actress mode, pretending to be the artist that made these paintings. And it's around this point that things start to fall apart. When Adele is walking through the city and happens to see some of the paintings on display at the fancy Delarue Art Gallery, and she recognizes these as belonging to Chris. She heads back home and yells at him, telling him that he's just a copycat artist. This scene is fantastic, as he's there wearing this floral apron. He's got a sharp knife in his hand as he's slicing up liver. You can't help but wonder what's going on in his head at this point. Well, Chris goes to Kitty's apartment to find out what is going on with the paintings, and sees all of his art is gone. But instead of getting angry or anything, he seems content to let her sign her name on the paintings as her own and to get the public attention. Once again, this poor guy really doesn't get what's going on here. But around this point, another interesting event happens. Adele's first husband, Detective Higgins, actor Charles Kemper, appears and he wants to meet with Chris. It was believed that he had died in a drowning incident, but no, not only had he survived, but he also stole money from the woman he was supposedly saving, and then he faked his death. And he wants to blackmail Chris in order to keep things quiet, that he's actually alive, not realizing that this could be a golden opportunity for Chris to actually get out of his marriage if it's discovered that her first husband is still alive. So Chris sets up a trap and lures Higgins into the dark house at night, telling him where he can go to get Adele's life insurance bonds. But then he springs the trap, turns on the light, revealing Higgins to Adele. And Chris quietly escapes, thinking that at last he has freedom from his terrible marriage and he can go and marry Kitty. Now it's here that the film really starts to take a dark turn. So he goes off to see Kitty, but when he arrives at her apartment, he sees her in a passionate embrace with Johnny. He waits for him to leave and then goes talk to Kitty, and he still wants to marry her. But she turns cold and laughs at him and taunts him. And at this point, everything has just come to a boiling point. Chris realizes he's been used, that everything was just a lie, and that Johnny is her true love. And she just yells at him to get out. And this is the point where Chris just snaps and he loses it, grabs an ice pick, and he kills her.
He is a man. You want to marry me? You? Get out of here. Get out. Get away from me. Chris! Chris, get away from me. Chris! Chris!
And what follows is that Johnny, the abusive boyfriend, he's the one that is accused of the murder and brought to trial. He pleads for his innocence, but no one believes him. Even Chris testifies to his own innocence, in his own way bringing revenge upon these two. But the film is far from over. With about 15 minutes left, I'm going to stop the summary here because I don't want to give away the final ending. This one is so good that you need to go see the ending for yourself to see how this wraps up. Where the character Chris goes from here, after his heart is broken and he's driven to this terrible act of revenge. This film's in the public domain. It's on Prime, so you can go check it out and see how it ends. But wow, what an ending. Scarlet Street was a brilliant work of film noir, and there was just so much that I loved about this film. You know, going into this, knowing very little about what the film was about, what I loved was a complete unpredictability of the story. I mean, was this a crime film? Was it going to be romance, suspense, murder? Well, yes and no. There's elements of all of that. And yet, at its core, it's a story of a meek and likable middle-aged guy who falls for a very lovely, yet very manipulative young woman and is lured along by her artificial affections until everything just comes crashing down. This film isn't always easy to watch because Chris seems like a decent type of guy. You can relate to him. He works hard. He's liked by his peers. They even gave him a watch. And we want his character to have some happiness. But the way he's going about it, we know, won't end well. In fact, we know all along there's no way that this can end well for this guy, and yet we keep believing in him as he's led along. There's never any moment in the film when we see that Kitty has any sort of genuine affection for him. She's just using this guy, and it's heartbreaking, and yet fascinating to watch. We need to see what happens, and when we do, we're kind of sorry that we did. Scarlet Street was produced and directed by Fritz Lang, the famous German director of amazing films like Metropolis in 1927. There was a very similar film the year before, The Woman in the Window, that was also directed by Lang and starred Edward G. Robinson, Joan Bennett, and Dan Duryea. So I might have to check that one out. According to Ben Mankiewicz of TCM, when this film was first released, the local censor boards in New York, Milwaukee, and Atlanta banned this film entirely for being, quote, licentious, profane, obscure, and contrary to the good order of the community. Edward G. Robinson was brilliant in the lead role here. You know, he was well known for playing gangster-type characters in the 1930s. I mean, heck, my earliest memories of Robinson was that of him as the cigar-chomping maroon in the old Bugs Bunny cartoons. But here he's a pathetic character. You can't help but empathize with him, even though his fate is sealed in this one. I have to say that this is probably one of my favorite non-Little Caesar gangster-style roles that I've ever seen Edward G. Robinson in. Again, you just believe in the poor guy, and you want him to have a little joy in his life, but you know it's not going to happen. And Joan Bennett was excellent as the calculating, manipulative character Kitty. You know, she's something because you watch her in this film. She's a gorgeous actress, but her character is just so repugnant in how she's so superficially sweet to Chris, but basically stabbing him in the back at the same time. She's so good at playing him, it almost makes you angry. And I've really grown to enjoy Dan Duryea as an actor, especially when he's playing the slimy creep. You know, he's a manipulative jerk. He treats Kitty poorly. He calls her things like lazy legs and slaps her around through the film. Now, there is the implication in the film that maybe he's a pimp and she's a working girl, but the film never goes so far as to say so. So for all we know, she could just be a failed actress out of work and he's just an abusive boyfriend, because the film does make reference to her acting abilities. You know, in this Hays Code era, I'm guessing they had to tone down the implications of that relationship. Well, let me wrap this one up. Scarlet Street, it was an excellent film noir, but just being completely honest here, it can be a challenge to get through because it's hard to watch. Basically, a story about a decent guy who takes a fall like this. You know, one review I looked at called it the most depressing film of all time. I wouldn't go that far, but it's definitely not a hopeful story. You know where it's going, and again, I'm not going to ruin the ending, but this isn't Miracle on 34th Street. Don't expect a happy ending. It was a beautifully made movie, though. The story is compelling, acting is exceptional, and even though it can be a little bit dreary on the way, it is still an amazing film noir, and it's totally one that's worth checking out.